For months, one question has lingered around the ongoing controversy surrounding the Whitaker family. Who was actually in control? Was it the public-facing creator who appeared on camera? Was it the person organizing donations behind the scenes? Or was control concentrated somewhere entirely different? Now, Patrick Ror has stepped forward with a series of statements that, if accurate, paint a very different picture of how decisions were made surrounding the Whitakers, the donations, and the growing online attention surrounding the family. His comments do not settle the debate. Instead, they open an entirely new one. Throughout this documentary, we'll examine Patrick's own statements, compare them with the public record and previous discussions within the creator community, and separate verified facts from allegations that remain disputed. Because despite thousands of comments, countless live streams, and months of speculation, many questions still have no definitive public answers. Patrick's central claim is surprisingly straightforward. He says he was never the one controlling the money. According to him, Eric Carroll controlled every dollar. That single assertion changes the entire framework of the controversy. If Patrick is telling the truth, then many assumptions people have made over the past several months deserve another look. If he is not, then the statement raises another set of difficult questions. Either way, it's a claim worth examining carefully. One of the first things Patrick addresses is a criticism that has followed the Whitaker story almost from the beginning: the role of public donations. Over time, supporters contributed significant amounts of money after seeing videos featuring members of the Whitaker family. Many viewers assumed those donations were being managed transparently. Others questioned who was actually making financial decisions. During his recent discussion, Patrick repeatedly points responsibility toward Eric Carroll. According to Patrick, Eric, not Patrick, handled the financial side of the operation. Patrick goes even further by referencing an amount that immediately caught viewers' attention. He states that Eric received approximately $240,000. It is an extremely specific figure, not around $200,000, not close to $250,000. He cites a number that sounds precise. At this point, however, Patrick does not publicly present documentation establishing exactly how that figure was calculated. That doesn't automatically make the claim false, but it does mean viewers should recognize the difference between an allegation and independently verified financial records. Specific numbers naturally invite questions. How was that amount calculated? Did it include every donation? Was it based on platform earnings? Did it include merchandise, fundraising campaigns, or other revenue? Without supporting documentation, those questions remain unanswered. Still, Patrick's willingness to attach a specific figure immediately shifts public discussion. Rather than making a vague accusation, he places a concrete number into the conversation, one that many viewers immediately began discussing. Another recurring theme throughout Patrick's comments involves control. Not simply financial control, operational control. Who made decisions? Who approved purchases? Who decided where donations were spent? According to Patrick, many of those decisions ultimately rested with Eric Carroll. One example that continues resurfacing is the purchase of an air conditioner. At first glance, it seems like a minor issue, an appliance, a routine purchase. But within the broader controversy, it has become symbolic. Patrick explains that he personally did not have the money to purchase the air conditioner. Instead, he says Eric paid for it initially before later reimbursing himself using funds connected to the Whitakers. Again, this is Patrick's account. Whether that accurately reflects what occurred would require financial records or documentation that has not been publicly presented. Interestingly, the discussion doesn't stop there. Some critics question the condition of the air conditioner itself. Instead of appearing brand new, they argued it looked noticeably worn. Others questioned why it was installed where it was. Was it placed there because it best served the Whitaker family? or because it benefited someone else who regularly visited the property? Those questions have circulated online for months. At present, there is no publicly verified evidence establishing the reason for its placement. Nevertheless, the air conditioner has become far more than an appliance. For many followers, it represents a larger concern about transparency. Small purchases often reveal larger management decisions. And when trust begins to erode, even ordinary transactions attract extraordinary scrutiny. Patrick also spends time responding to criticism involving his relationship with other content creators. That discussion quickly expands beyond individual disagreements. Instead, it highlights how fractured the creator community has become. People who once collaborated now publicly disagree. Former allies question one another's credibility. Information once shared privately becomes public discussion. The result is an environment where nearly every statement is immediately challenged by someone else with a competing version of events. Patrick argues that not every criticism directed toward him is fair. At the same time, others who have commented publicly about the situation have suggested Patrick himself has changed positions over time. Those conflicting perspectives illustrate one of the biggest challenges facing anyone attempting to understand this story. Nearly every participant believes their version represents the truth. Yet many of those versions contradict each other. Another issue Patrick addresses involves the names of Timmy, Ray, and Lorraine. Some online discussions have referred to them collectively rather than individually. Others insist they should always be recognized as people with distinct personalities rather than simply becoming part of a larger narrative. That perspective resonates with many viewers regardless of where they stand on the surrounding controversy. It serves as a reminder that beneath every online dispute are real individuals whose lives became the focus of enormous public attention. As the conversation continues, Patrick also discusses donations made with his personal money. He specifically references purchasing clothing. According to Patrick, those purchases came directly from his own funds rather than from money associated with the Whitakers. If accurate, that distinction matters. Using personal money is fundamentally different from spending donated funds intended for someone else. Again, verifying those claims publicly would require financial documentation beyond statements made during live streams. One recurring criticism Patrick appears determined to answer is the suggestion that every purchase connected to the Whitakers originated from donated money. His response attempts to draw a line between personal generosity and managed funds. Whether viewers accept that distinction depends largely on how much confidence they place in Patrick's account. Perhaps one of the more revealing aspects of the discussion is not what Patrick says. It's what he repeatedly emphasizes. He insists that certain decisions were never his to make. He portrays himself less as the financial manager and more as someone participating within a system controlled by someone else. If that portrayal is accurate, responsibility for major financial decisions may lie elsewhere. If it is inaccurate, critics argue it could represent an effort to distance himself from growing public scrutiny. Without independent records, determining which explanation is correct remains difficult. Another interesting feature of Patrick's responses is what he chooses not to claim. He does not argue that every accusation against Eric has already been proven, nor does he present himself as possessing complete documentation during this discussion. Instead, many of his remarks rely on his personal recollection and experience. That distinction matters. Personal testimony can be valuable, but it is not identical to independently verified evidence. As viewers, recognizing that difference is essential. Throughout the Whitaker controversy, one recurring problem has been the blending of first-hand accounts with assumptions, speculation, and online rumors. Once those become intertwined, separating fact from opinion becomes increasingly difficult. Patrick's recent comments contribute additional first-hand claims. They do not automatically resolve the broader questions. They simply add another perspective to an already complicated story. The discussion also touches on Justin Morris, another figure whose role has generated disagreement within the community. Patrick suggests Justin did possess some accurate information, even if not every claim attributed to him ultimately proved correct. That nuance is important. In polarized online communities, people are often treated as entirely credible or entirely unreliable. Reality is usually more complicated. Someone can be correct about certain events while mistaken about others. Acknowledging that complexity often leads to a more accurate understanding than assuming every statement from one person must either be accepted completely or rejected entirely. As Patrick continues speaking, one message becomes increasingly clear. He wants viewers to reconsider who is actually making decisions behind the scenes. Whether discussing purchases, donations, or interactions with supporters, he repeatedly returns to the same central point. According to Patrick, Eric Carroll controlled the money. That allegation forms the backbone of everything else he says. If true, it significantly changes how many earlier events might be interpreted. If false, it becomes one of the most consequential disputed claims in the entire controversy. Either way, it raises questions that continue to fuel debate among followers of the Whitaker story. And those questions become even more significant once the conversation shifts beyond purchases and donations toward allegations involving vehicles, fundraising, and whether the public was ever given the complete story. Those claims would take the controversy into an entirely new direction. As Patrick's discussion continues, the focus begins shifting away from individual purchases and towards something much larger: transparency. For many viewers following the Whitaker story, the biggest question was never whether someone bought an air conditioner or a set of clothes. The real question was much broader. Who was making the decisions? Who approved expenditures? Who owned the assets that were being discussed publicly? And perhaps most importantly, who ultimately benefited from the money generated around the Whitaker family's online presence? Patrick's answers don't provide definitive proof. Instead, they offer his version of events, one that differs significantly from what many viewers had assumed. One of the most discussed subjects involves a vehicle that has become almost as controversial as the fundraising itself: the Range Rover. For months, the vehicle has been the subject of rumors, live-stream debates, and conflicting explanations. Some viewers believed it was purchased using donated funds. Others argued it was a personal gift. Still others questioned why it later disappeared altogether. Patrick addresses those questions directly. According to him, the Range Rover was purchased with his own money. He insists it was never paid for using donations intended for the Whitakers. He describes it as a personal gift rather than an expense charged against money raised for the family. That distinction is important. If accurate, it separates the vehicle from allegations involving donated funds. However, Patrick's explanation also raises another obvious question. If it truly was a gift, why was it later sold? Patrick answers that as well. He states simply that he sold it. For supporters, that explanation may sound straightforward. For critics, however, it leaves additional questions unanswered. When exactly was the vehicle transferred? Who legally owned it during that period? Was there written documentation? Was ownership ever formally transferred? Those details have not been fully addressed through publicly available documentation. As a result, discussions surrounding the Range Rover continue today. Interestingly, Patrick's comments are not the only version of events that is circulated. Other individuals involved in or commenting on the Whitaker story have described the vehicle differently. Some claimed the gift might later have been used to offset money allegedly owed. Others rejected that interpretation entirely. These conflicting narratives illustrate one of the central problems surrounding this controversy. Very few participants appear to agree on the same timeline. Even when discussing the same event, their explanations often differ in meaningful ways. Without independent records, determining which version most accurately reflects reality becomes difficult. That uncertainty has fueled months of speculation. Patrick also responds to criticism concerning his motivations for becoming involved with the Whitaker family in the first place. Some online discussions suggested financial gain was always the primary objective. Patrick disputes that characterization. He acknowledges that money became part of the conversation, but rejects the idea that helping the family was merely a business opportunity. Again, this remains his perspective. Motivation is often one of the hardest things to verify because it exists largely inside a person's own intentions. Observers may draw conclusions based on actions, while the individual involved may describe entirely different reasons. Neither perspective alone automatically settles the matter. Throughout his discussion, Patrick repeatedly attempts to distinguish between financial management and personal involvement. He portrays himself as someone who genuinely cared about members of the Whitaker family while simultaneously insisting that control over donated money rested elsewhere. Whether viewers find that explanation convincing depends largely on how they interpret the broader history surrounding the case. Another interesting topic involved public perception. Patrick acknowledges that once creators choose to document their activities online, public scrutiny inevitably follows. That observation may be one of the least controversial points raised throughout the discussion. When viewers donate money, invest emotionally in a story, and follow a family for years, many naturally develop expectations regarding accountability. They begin asking questions. How much money was raised? Where was it spent? Who approved major purchases? What records exist? These are not unusual questions. In fact, they are often expected whenever public fundraising becomes involved. Patrick appears frustrated by what he sees as assumptions being made without evidence. At the same time, critics argue that limited transparency created many of those assumptions in the first place. That tension reflects a larger issue extending well beyond this single controversy. Trust is difficult to build. Once damaged, it becomes even harder to restore. One moment during Patrick's discussion stands out because it shifts attention away from himself. He references the possibility of individuals coming forward to describe previous experiences involving Eric Carroll. Patrick suggests there are others who believe they experienced similar patterns of behavior. At the time of these remarks, however, those accounts had not all been publicly presented alongside supporting documentation. If additional witnesses or records emerge, they may contribute valuable context. Until then, such statements remain allegations rather than established facts. This distinction matters. Documentary analysis should always separate claims from verified evidence. Doing otherwise risks confusing possibility with proof. Another point Patrick raises concerns online fundraising efforts. According to his account, there were attempts to organize additional fundraising activities connected to the Whitaker family. He also suggests that outside individuals question those efforts before they gain momentum. Public fundraising naturally attracts attention because contributors expect accountability. Whenever large numbers of people donate based on emotional stories, questions regarding oversight become inevitable. That doesn't automatically imply wrongdoing. It simply reflects the reality that transparency becomes increasingly important as financial support grows. Patrick also touches on something often overlooked during public controversies: reputation. Once accusations begin circulating online, they spread quickly. Correcting inaccurate information becomes extraordinarily difficult. Even if later evidence contradicts an early claim, the original allegation often continues circulating long afterward. That phenomenon affects nearly everyone involved in highly public internet disputes. Patrick himself argues that many assumptions about him have been repeated without sufficient evidence. His critics make similar arguments about statements directed toward them. The result is an environment where competing narratives coexist, each supported by communities convinced their interpretation is correct. For outside observers, separating documented facts from emotional reactions becomes increasingly challenging. Another issue discussed involves a post office box. Although it may seem like a relatively minor administrative matter, it became another example of conflicting explanations. Patrick suggested there were limitations preventing the Whitakers from obtaining a separate post office box. Others disputed that assertion, pointing out that individuals can generally maintain both residential mail service and a post office box simultaneously. This disagreement illustrates something important. Not every inconsistency necessarily indicates deception. Sometimes people misunderstand policies. Sometimes they receive incorrect information. Sometimes memories differ. Without official documentation or direct confirmation from relevant authorities, relatively small disagreements can quickly evolve into larger controversies. Patrick's broader point, however, remains consistent. He argues that logistical decisions involving the Whitakers were often more complicated than viewers realized. Whether those complications justify the decisions made remains open to interpretation. Throughout the discussion, Patrick also comments on changing relationships with other creators. People who were once considered trusted allies gradually became critics. Others who previously criticized him later found common ground on specific issues. These shifting alliances reveal how fluid online communities can become. Support often changes as new information emerges, or as perceptions change. Perhaps one of the most revealing aspects of Patrick's discussion is what it suggests about trust itself. Trust does not disappear overnight. Instead, it often erodes gradually. A question here, a missing explanation there, conflicting timelines, incomplete documentation. Eventually, even relatively ordinary decisions become subjects of intense public examination. That appears to be exactly what happened throughout the Whitaker controversy. Viewers who initially accepted explanations without hesitation later began revisiting earlier events. Routine purchases suddenly appeared significant. Old livestream clips were re-examined. Past statements were compared against newer ones. Patterns, real or perceived, became central to the conversation. Patrick clearly believes many viewers have blamed the wrong person. His argument is remarkably consistent throughout the discussion. He portrays Eric Carroll as the individual exercising financial control while describing himself as someone whose public role exceeded his actual authority. Whether that portrayal accurately reflects reality remains one of the central unanswered questions. At several points, Patrick emphasizes that he has no objection to legitimate questions. Instead, he objects to conclusions being reached before all available evidence has been examined. That perspective resonates with an important principle. Questions are essential. Conclusions require evidence. The distinction between those two ideas often becomes blurred during emotionally charged online controversies. As the conversation continues, Patrick returns repeatedly to one underlying message. He believes the public never saw the complete picture. According to him, many of the decisions that later became controversial were made behind the scenes by individuals who rarely appeared at the center of public attention. If accurate, that would significantly reshape public understanding of the Whitaker story. But extraordinary claims require careful examination. Statements alone, even detailed ones, cannot replace documentation. Financial records, contracts, receipts, official communications. Those forms of evidence ultimately carry greater weight than personal recollections alone. Patrick appears aware of that reality. Several times, he suggests additional information may eventually emerge. Whether that happens remains to be seen. For now, viewers are left with competing narratives and incomplete records. One narrative places Patrick at the center of financial decision-making. The other, presented by Patrick himself, argues that Eric Carroll controlled nearly every major financial decision connected to the Whitakers. Somewhere between those competing accounts lies the full story. Finding it requires more than choosing sides. It requires patience, documentation, and a willingness to examine every claim using the same standard of evidence. Because once public trust is broken, restoring it demands far more than explanations. It requires proof. And as Patrick's discussion enters its final section, the conversation moves beyond vehicles and fundraising toward an even more fundamental issue: credibility. Who should viewers believe? Who has remained consistent? And after months of conflicting stories, is it still possible to reconstruct what really happened? As Patrick's discussion comes to a close, the conversation is no longer centered on a single purchase, a single fundraiser, or even a single disagreement. Instead, it becomes a broader reflection on credibility. Over the course of the Whitaker controversy, viewers have been presented with countless live streams, interviews, screenshots, personal testimonies, and opinions. Some of those claims overlap. Others directly contradict one another. For anyone trying to understand the full story, separating fact from speculation has become increasingly difficult. Patrick's latest statements add another important perspective, but they do not provide the final answer. His central position remains consistent throughout the discussion. According to Patrick, Eric Carroll controlled the financial side of the Whitaker operation. He maintains that major spending decisions, fundraising oversight, and financial management were not ultimately his responsibility. That claim is significant because it challenges the assumptions many viewers have held for months. At the same time, it is important to remember that these are Patrick's allegations. They have not, by themselves, been independently verified through publicly available financial records or official findings. One of the recurring themes throughout this entire controversy is the absence of complete documentation in the public domain. Instead of relying on organized financial reports, much of the discussion has been driven by live-stream clips, personal recollections, screenshots, and competing interpretations of events. That leaves room for misunderstanding. It also leaves room for speculation. Patrick repeatedly argues that people have reached conclusions before seeing the entire picture. His critics, on the other hand, argue that unanswered questions and limited transparency created those suspicions in the first place. Both perspectives point to the same underlying issue: trust. When donations are collected from thousands of supporters, transparency becomes more than good practice, it becomes an expectation. Viewers naturally want to know where money went, how decisions were made, and whether promises matched reality. Without clear records, even relatively small questions can grow into major controversies. Patrick also makes it clear that he does not believe every criticism directed at him has been fair. He acknowledges mistakes but suggests that public attention has overlooked the role other individuals may have played behind the scenes. Whether viewers agree with that assessment is ultimately up to them. As with any complex public controversy, one person's account should never be treated as the complete story. Instead, it should be considered alongside other available evidence. Perhaps the most important takeaway from Patrick's discussion is not any single allegation, but the reminder that public narratives are often incomplete. Online audiences usually see edited videos, selected moments, and public statements. They rarely see every private conversation, financial record, or decision-making process that occurs behind the scenes. That reality makes careful analysis essential. It also reinforces why documentary discussions should distinguish between verified facts, personal testimony, and unresolved allegations. The Whitaker story has always been about more than internet drama. At its heart are real people whose lives became the subject of enormous public attention. Whatever conclusions are eventually reached, the human element should not be forgotten. As new claims continue to emerge, the most responsible approach is to evaluate each one using the same standard. What is supported by evidence? What remains disputed? And what questions are still waiting to be answered? Those questions matter far more than choosing sides. Because in the end, credibility is not built through accusations alone. It is built through consistency, transparency, and evidence. Only time, and perhaps additional documentation, will determine whether Patrick's account accurately reflects what happened behind the scenes or whether it becomes one perspective among many in a story that remains unresolved. For now, the debate continues, and until more verified information becomes available, many of the biggest questions surrounding the Whitakers, the donations, and the people involved remain exactly that, questions. If you've been following this story from the beginning, what do you think? Do Patrick's recent statements change your perspective, or do they raise even more questions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want more balanced documentary-style analyses of ongoing internet stories, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation.